served as senior legislative assistant to 2 members of Congress. Mark served as a pastor for a number of years and currently has an independent consulting and writing ministry. With this diverse background, he has a unique perspective on the causes and cures to what presently ails our American culture. Convinced that it is every American's duty to engage in the struggle against tyranny, Mark is coming to give the nuts and bolts of how each of us can do something to help beat back tyranny and restore liberty in America. Here to present Liberty or Tyranny, What We Can Do, please join Give Me Liberty in welcoming Mr. Mark Kreslins to the stage.
A resolution proposed by Mr. Lee. That these colonies are, and of a right ought to be, free and independent states, and that all political connection between them and the country of Great Britain is, and of a right ought to be, totally dissolved.
New Hampshire.
New Hampshire votes yes.
Rhode Island.
Rhode Island votes yes.
Massachusetts.
Massachusetts votes yes.
New York.
New York has yet to receive new instructions from its constituent assembly. We therefore respectfully abstain.
Connecticut.
Connecticut votes yes.
New Jersey.
New Jersey votes yes.
Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania votes yes.
Delaware.
Delaware votes yes.
Virginia.
Virginia votes yes.
Maryland.
Maryland votes yes.
North Carolina.
North Carolina votes yes.
South Carolina.
South Carolina votes yes.
Georgia.
Georgia votes yes.
The vote stands 12 for independence, none against, with 1 abstention. The resolution carries. When, in the course of human events,
That's the sound you hear as the director gives us an opportunity to imagine what those 56 men must have felt like as they sat in the room and prepared to take on the most powerful military force known to mankind as they declared their independence. As the camera pans across the room, you see delegate after delegate. They understood the magnitude of the decision they had just made, but they also understood the magnitude of the problem. And friends, we're here tonight because we believe we're at that same place right now. And just as they understood who their tyranny was and where it was coming from, it was King George in the Parliament 3,000 miles away, we need to know where our tyrant is and where our tyranny comes from. It comes from Washington, D.C. Amen. We are thrilled to be up here with other people that see that problem, because you cannot fix the problem until we understand the problem. Now, you're here tonight because you believe we have solutions. And I'm here to tell you that we do have solutions. But if you're here tonight hoping to hear easy solutions, I'm sad to tell you we have none. But really, should there be easy solutions at this point? Does it even make sense that there's some easy way to get out of the mess that's been created over generations? Of course it doesn't. Now, the question really is going to be for each one of us in this room tonight, and as we go across the state presenting this message, the real question is going to be, do we have the same amount of courage those 56 men did you just saw in that John Adams movie? Do we have the same courage of our convictions that they did? And as Christians, do we trust God enough to engage in solutions that may seem to be difficult and a little bit uncomfortable and even scary? But are we ready? Let me tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Mark Kreslins. I've co-pastored churches back in Maryland. I fled Maryland 2 years ago now to come down here. Maryland is a tough place to talk about real solutions. I worked as a senior legislative assistant for two members of Congress, Congressman George Wortley from upstate New York and Congressman Richard Baker. He chaired the House Financial Services Committee. Currently, I'm an independent consultant, a freelance writer, and I'm host of the wildly popular radio show called The Forgotten Men Show. And by a show of hands, how many people in this room have listened to that show? Can somebody just please raise a hand? Just once. I'm waiting for one crowd. Well, we broadcast up in the Mid-Atlantic area, so you wouldn't hear it down here. But I'm always hoping that maybe somebody traveling through the Mid-Atlantic area would have picked up our broadcast, because these solutions are what we talk about every Saturday from 12 to 2 on 930 WFMD. But here I want to begin by asking you to let your mind wander. I want you to let your mind wander to a time when the IRS is no longer legally stealing your money and your property. How many people, by a show of hands in this room, go to their mailbox and take out an envelope with the initials or the letters IRS at the top of it and quickly say to themselves, "Oh, I'm so glad I heard from my government today"? Nobody does. We take that envelope out, we see the letters IRS, and what happens? The hair stands up in the back of our neck, doesn't it? And it's like, oh, what did I do now? I'm in trouble. Is that what government is supposed to be? How about a day when the TSA is no longer molesting our wives and our daughters? How about the NSA no longer violating our privacy against our will, against our consent? How about the DHS looming around the corner? Obamacare forcing us by law to buy health insurance or pay a fine? Or this one, how about a day when abortion is ended in Oklahoma? Amen. The question's going to become, how willing are you to be courageous and sacrifice to stop abortion in this state? Because I'm here to tell you tonight, we can stop it. We could stop it tomorrow if we wanted to. But this day can only happen if we change our approach to politics. And herein lies the problem. We're stuck. We're stuck in status quo thinking about politics. And you're here tonight because you know year after year goes by and things don't seem to change. Well, they do change. Let me say that. They change for the worse. They're not getting better. I want to ask you a couple of questions. By a show of hands, how many people in this room believe that Washington, D.C. is broke? Every hand. How about how many people in this room believe that Washington, D.C. is broken? And how many people in this room believe that Washington, D.C. cannot fix Washington, D.C.? Please, both hands go up. Amen. We're getting charismatic in here tonight. Yes, Washington, D.C. cannot fix Washington, D.C. And I'll tell you how I know this. As you saw on the previous screen, I used to work as a senior legislative assistant for two members of Congress. One of my jobs was to advise the member of Congress how to vote. And not one time in my time on Capitol Hill, whether we were voting, sponsoring, or co-sponsoring legislation, I am embarrassed to say this, but not one time did I pull out my handy-dandy Constitution and say, do we have any authority to do what we're about to do? Not one time. I hate to have to admit that. I was part of the problem. And it wasn't just me. My boss didn't care. Trent Lott was in the office across from me when I worked in the House. They didn't care. Nobody opened the Constitution. The Constitution is nothing more than a campaign prop today. That's all it is. And we all know it, don't we? Otherwise, how did the government get as big as it did? Here's the problem. We all know it. We're $17 trillion in debt with no end in sight. There's 55 million dead babies. We are way too comfortable with big numbers. It doesn't matter to us anymore. What's 55 million? Well, it's 56 million. There's an utter contempt of privacy by our government. They don't care. They are going to listen in, they are going to read, and they're going to watch anything they want to. It's never a good idea for government to have your private information. Don't buy the line, if I'm not doing anything wrong, I got nothing to worry about. That's what they want you to think. Obamacare, undeclared wars, the IRS, the nationalization of education called Common Core. Oh, that's just wonderful, isn't it? They're after our children now. Folks, we've got to begin with this. This is a bipartisan problem. Both parties are at fault here. The GOP is not better than the DNC. There is no data to prove that. In fact, if you'll remember your brief history, your recent history, in 2003, the Republicans were in charge of the House, the Senate, and the White House. Where did they get any authority whatsoever to pass Medicare Part D or the Patriot Act? There's nothing in the Constitution that supposedly these guys are obeying that gave them the authority to do it. We have to become far more loyal to liberty than to party. The parties want you to believe, we got the answers, just vote for us. The data doesn't prove that. Here's some data to prove my point. Since 1980 to 2010, some of the latest figures, both parties have been in charge of Washington, D.C. Complete charge. They've had the House, the Senate, and the White House. Look at the debt under both parties. These are just facts. Here's another one. Since 1920 all the way to 1980, the federal debt as a percentage of GDP was kind of flat. From 1980 on, it took off like the space shuttle. They're breaking the 8th and 10th commandment every single day. Do you know why? We're not supposed to be stealing, but we're stealing from our children and our grandchildren to pay our current liabilities. How moral is that? Right now, each one of us owes $54,614. And actually, it's more than that because that's about a month and a half old slide. We probably owe $56,000 now. This is just the facts, and all of this happened on our watch. The church has got some repenting to do. How about this one, abortion? It has been estimated that 55 million babies have been killed since the unconstitutional Roe versus Wade. I use the word unconstitutional deliberately. You know why? Because Article 3 of the United States Constitution delegates zero authority to 9 politically connected attorneys in black robes to make us kill babies. There's nothing there. There's nothing in Article 3 that said the Supreme Court can make that ruling, but they did. What have we done to stop it? In Oklahoma, since 2002, we've killed 63,241 babies in the state. 40 or 50 of them lost their life today. Today, in this 24-hour period, babies lost their life in this state. These abortions have happened on our watch, friends. It's sober, and it's hard to hear this, but it's necessary to hear it. If it's going to muster up the courage in us to stop this, because we can. And as I go into my presentation, I'm going to show you how to do it. Exactly how to do it. You see, folks, we've always had the power to stop this. We all remember the famous video or movie. We watched it when we were growing up, Wizard of Oz. You remember the end scene where Dorothy is there with Scarecrow and Tin Man, and the hot air balloon floats off, and Dorothy's still there, and she's stuck, and she knows she's stuck, but she wants to go back to Kansas. And then the pink orb comes in, and it lands, and Good Witch Glinda hops out, and she walks up, and she says, Dorothy, you always had the power to go back to Kansas. You just click your heels 3 times, and off you go. Well, folks, the reality is we've always had the power to stop this. Now, before I go too far in my what appears to be self-arrogance, let me assure you, I did not know this until I knew this. I'm not up here just to preach at you and tell you, oh, I've been doing this, and now you guys need to do it. I didn't know I didn't know how to stop this. Now I know how to stop this. And I'm going to stop it. Romans 13:1 says this, let everyone be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. There is no disagreement whatsoever that God establishes government. In his providential sovereignty, he established a representative republic on July 4th, 1776. And the key feature of a representative republic is this. It is the people have all the power. God in his sovereignty allowed a representative republic to emerge on the planet Earth July 4th, 1776. Putting all political power in the people. Not a king, not a legislature, not a parliament, and not a president. God didn't give us a new king. He allowed a representative republic to emerge. I'm going to explain to you how I can prove that. The key to a representative republic is this. It's us. It's you and me. We are the final power. But first, before we can move into the solutions, I want to address a few unworkable strategies that we've got to get rid of. We've just got to purge them out of our mind. The first one is this: voting, hoping, and then coping. Aren't we tired of that? We vote and then we cross our fingers, and I know we're not supposed to believe in luck, but we do it anyways. We cross our fingers and we say, oh, please, maybe it'll work this time. And then we're left coping with the reality shortly after that it ain't. It is no different. Actually, it's going to just get a little more worse. Or this one. This is the most important election of our lifetime. Any day, you're going to turn on mainstream talk radio, and you're going to hear some talk show host say, this is the most important election of our lifetime. By a show of hands, how many people in this room have heard that over 10 times? Take back America, we're told. This is a particularly difficult one for Christians, because I can find nowhere in the Gospels where Jesus instructed his disciples to take back Israel. Neither did he tell the Apostle Paul to go and take back Asia Minor, go and take back Corinth. As Christians, we have to be very careful how we work in politics. We're told to be salt and light to a lost world. Well, we all know that salt can both be seasoning and it can be caustic. Every one of us at some point have cut our finger and put it in near salt, and it hurts. Well, sometimes as Christians, we're caustic salt. We say things that don't honor God. Likewise, with light, stick your eye right next to a light bulb and turn it on. It's blinding. I think Jesus is speaking about light being illuminating, lighting it up. As Christians, we have to be careful with these militaristic terms, such as take back America. From who? Who owns it right now that we're taking it back from? Sounds great, but it never, ever works. It's just rhetoric. And lastly, we've just got to get more conservatives in the Congress or the White House. I love hearing that. That's great. You guys understand that that's not working. The 2010 Tea Party revolution, how'd that work out? Those guys just took advantage of the opportunity to get their fannies into power. They're breaking their oath all the time. You got one here in Tulsa that doesn't. You're real fortunate, believe me. Count your blessings. Amen. Because that's not the case in the other 434 of them. So, the evidence is 100% clear, folks. These strategies have not, they will not, and they cannot work. We've got to jettison them. As attractive as they sound, and as much as your heart's going to begin to beat when you hear this is the most important election of our lifetime, you've got to just turn it off and say, no, this is not the most important election of our lifetime. Otherwise, you just get distracted by that solution, and you'll end up campaigning for somebody that has no intention of keeping their oath. Here's the reality, folks. To begin our solution part, we've got to begin to focus just on Oklahoma. Let's not worry about other states, okay? Let's not worry about what they're doing in Maryland. Let's not worry about what they're doing in New Hampshire, what they're doing in Vermont, what they're doing in Michigan, what they're doing in California. How about we just worry about what's going on here? Because right now, we've got be very careful how I say this. We've got a federal district judge with absolutely no authority in the Constitution coming into our state and striking down our Constitution. We should be angry about that. He has no authority in the Constitution to come in and strike down our duly ratified constitutional amendment to our Constitution that defines marriage between one man and one woman. The people decided that. And if the people are the power, where does he get the authority to come into our state and tell us no? We got to think about Oklahoma, and just Oklahoma. Because in the end, folks, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over and over again, expecting different results. Sadly, most of us are politically insane. Myself included, I used to do this until I figured out there are other ways. Here are the key elements of the Declaration, and we're going to get into the solutions part now. It says this: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and amongst them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And now here is the most important line, in my view, probably ever written about political theory in all of mankind. This next line: that to secure these rights, governments are instituted amongst men, deriving their just power from who? The consent of the governed. By a show of hands, how many people in this room are consenting to the baloney that's going on? And no hands ever go up every time I ask that question. Because you're not consenting to this. Well, if we can consent to government, isn't there also an opposite of that? We can withdraw our consent? Or is consent just a one-way street? We give it and we can never take it back. Here are the principles of liberty real quickly. Only mankind possess unalienable rights. That to secure these unalienable rights, government has one job, and that is to protect unalienable rights by the consent of the government. That's all they're supposed to do, is protect unalienable rights. So what happens when government fails in its one sole responsibility? That's it. It only has one thing to do, and that is secure unalienable rights. What do you do when government fails in that one responsibility? Well, here's the scary part, folks, and here I want you to buckle up because it's going to get a little bit nerve-wracking. You're going to have heard these words before, and I can prove that every one of them comes from our history because they're in our founding documents, but they're scary to us today. This is what Jefferson said to do. First, we've got to think big. We've got to expand our thinking on the political solutions that are in front of us. We've got to then act big so we can decentralize power away from Washington, D.C. We need to take their power away from them. Amen. Please get excited about that. We're shooting for a complete restoration of federalism, nothing less. And this is what James Madison, the father of the Constitution, wrote, a famous definition of federalism. He says this: the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. And by a show of hands, how many people in this room believe that Washington, D.C. believes its powers to be few and defined? And of course they don't. They do whatever they can get away with, and they get away with a lot. But Madison said, this is what it's supposed to be like right here. The way it's supposed to be is the federal government is just this little orb that doesn't really do much to you, is not involved in your life very much. And this government here, the place we actually live, is the robust government. Because we can more easily change it, can't we? We all want to think we can change Washington, D.C. Is that working? This is what federalism is supposed to be according to Federalist 45. Sadly, this is what it's become. State governments are little tiny, not even governments anymore. They're almost counties. And when the federal government says jump, guess what they say? How high? And if you send me a little money, I'll jump really high. And this is what the monster has become, swallowing the state governments, the federal government. Solution number one, we've got to begin to think like the founders. Remember back to that opening video clip. And those 56 men sat around there and understood that they had tried everything they could. They had begged King George, please stop tyrannizing us. And every time they begged, it says in the Declaration that the injuries were just repeated. King George said, I'm just going to stick it to you a little more. They begged him to stop. This is what Jefferson says to do in the Declaration, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right, and later on in the document he says, and the duty of the people to alter or to abolish it or throw it off, and to institute new government laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such a form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and their happiness. Are there any sweaty palms at this point? We're not used to hearing those concepts. Let's talk about them for a minute. How do you alter the government? Well, you can nullify their unconstitutional laws, as Paul talked about in his presentation. You can just say no. We're not going to obey that. No, the federal government's not going to say, you know, guys, you are right and we are wrong. They're not going to say that. They're going to start threatening. And the question becomes, how much courage do we have? How much of a hit are we willing to take? What if they start threatening we're going to withhold your money? Well, what does that say about us? Aren't we participating in the breaking of the 8th and 10th commandment? When we insist on allowing the federal government to borrow money from future generations, our children and our grandchildren, to fund our current obligations? We're part of the problem, friends. Because if we do stand up to Washington, D.C., and we say no, you know what they're going to say? We're going to take your money away. We got to get ready for that. We're not right now. That's why we're doing what we're doing. You can abolish. Did you know that if all 50 states met in Boise, Idaho next week, they could all just get together and say, you know, we're sort of done with the federal government. We don't want it anymore. How great would that be? Any amens on that? Or we could just throw it off, the S word, secession. Can't say that word, can we? Secession is just an unalienable right to free association. We freely associate with our wives and our husbands, don't we? We freely pick the job and career we like. We freely pick the state we live in. We freely pick the movies we like to see. It's funny how we're allowed to freely associate everywhere else, but this one area, no, you can't freely associate there. That's what Jefferson says to do. You alter it, abolish it, or throw it off. Here's the reality, folks. The recent government shutdown taught us a lot that they did not want us to learn. It taught us that the world did not come to an end. Weren't we all treated to that every night? Well, the government shut down, the world's going to end. We found out that over 800,000 people are identified as non-essential personnel. I will tell you this, as a former business owner, I had no non-essential personnel working for me. The planes didn't fall out of the sky, the bridges didn't collapse, the food stayed on the shelves. The shutdown proved to us all that the federal government really isn't quite as necessary as we've been told. Now, is it? It's interesting, as the polling numbers began to grow and people began to get a little comfortable without all this federal government, we better get back in session and get this thing going again. They're going to figure it out. They don't need us. Solution number 2 is nullification. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution says this: the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. This is what James Madison says to do, the father of the Constitution. He got into a fight back in 1798 with President Adams over the Alien and Sedition Act. Now remember, this is 1798, just 9 short years after the ratification of the Constitution. They got in trouble already because Congress passed a law that said if you speak ill against President Adams or the government, you can be arrested. 25 people were arrested, 10 were thrown in jail. Where's that in the Constitution? This is what Madison says to do. In the case of a deliberate, palpable, and dangerous exercise of other powers not granted by the said compact, the states who are party thereto have the right and are in duty bound to interpose for the arresting of the progress of evil. Madison says you are to stop it. You're to stand in between your state and the federal government when it breaks its constitutional limitations. And what does Madison call it? Think about this for a minute. What does Madison call it when the government takes powers it was not delegated? Evil. Folks, we're putting up with evil. He's right. You didn't delegate any authority to them to tap your phone calls or intercept your messages. Jefferson says this, that whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. We are obeying unconstitutional laws to our own detriment and to the detriment of 55 million babies. Think about that. Former State Senator Randy Brogdon tried to block Real ID in the state. He stood on the floor and said the federal government has no authority to make us give a visual impression of our face. Real ID. Unfortunately, we don't have a governor nor a legislature that's willing to stand up and enforce that law. This guy, State Representative Lewis Morey, chairs the States' Rights Committee in the House. He's the new Thomas Jefferson. He's thinking about how can we stop Washington, D.C. He's put in more nullification bills this year than any other representative in the House this year. He's trying to stop Washington, D.C. And then this guy here, Representative Dan Fisher, he's going to come up after me and talk about the Black Robe Regiment, talk about a period of time where people did have the courage of their convictions. You should have seen him last year on the House floor as he supported and defended House Bill 1021, which would have nullified Obamacare in our state. He was Patrick Henry up there. You're fortunate you have a Representative Henke in here, who supported the nullification of House Bill 1021. Here's solution number 3. You've got to play your part. We're going to ask you here at the end of our presentation to fill out a card. We need you to connect with us because there's a couple things we're going to ask you to do. You've got to play your part. We need to raise up 500 activist leaders in this state that have the ability to make good arguments about stopping Washington, D.C. If you want to be one of those leaders, then on the card you have in front of you that we're going to ask you to turn in, please just write the word leader. We need to identify you. I guarantee in a crowd this size, there is somebody in here with a spiritual gift of leadership that God is calling you to get involved. If you're that, please connect with us. Here's what we need you to do right out of the gate. Go to the website, or go to Amazon.com and purchase this book and read it. Nullification, How to Resist Federal Tyranny in the 21st Century. It's a short book. You will become an expert in nullification, the historical background. You'll understand the constitutional basis for it, so that when we ask you to go to the Capitol and speak to your state representative about nullifying abortion in this state, you're going to be able to persuade them to do that. Because that's where we're headed, folks. In 4 years, if not sooner, we're going to nullify the evil practice of abortion in this state. Amen. But we cannot do it without your help. It's impossible. The 3 of us can't do this. This has got to be a team effort. There's got to be thousands and thousands of Oklahomans that are going to be able to be willing to stand against Washington, D.C. We're also going to nullify that silly federal district court judges striking down of our Constitution. We're going to tell them no. Amen. I'm going to play a little clip of a movie we have out in the back we'd ask you to buy tonight. It's $10. It's Nullification, the movie. Go home, get 4 or 5 of your friends together in your living room and watch this movie. You're going to be able to understand very clearly the part you have to play in this unfolding drama.
The Supreme Court may have their opinion on Obamacare, but let them come and enforce it.
In fact, think about Thomas Jefferson's attitude toward the federal courts. His argument was the federal courts are part of the problem. I mean, you want me to go and refer my disputes to them? They're part of the problem. The problem is the federal government, and last I checked, the federal courts are part of the federal government. They can't possibly be impartial arbiters.
A conservative group called the 10th Amendment Center has been pushing a lot of the anti-health reform stuff. But they put that in the context of nullification, and they're pushing for other kinds of nullification, too.
We have a federal health care nullification act to reject not just Obamacare mandates, but the entire idea that the federal government should be involved in health care at all.
Actually, I think of the 10th Amendment now, it's a relic of our failure. And future historians will look back and they'll see all the things that contributed to the demise of American prosperity, and they will say, but all they had to do was follow the 10th Amendment.
What can we do now about the loss of freedom? We can persuade the state governments to defy the feds in areas like health care, where the Constitution gives the federal government zero authority, and to nullify all the laws the Congress has written that are not based on the Constitution.
But one issue that I think that we have to revisit, because the founders understood it, but we have forgotten about it, and that is the principle of nullification.
The federal government said Jefferson cannot have a monopoly on determining what its own powers are, because we all know what it's going to do. It's going to suddenly determine that it has more and more and more and more and more powers. It's going to keep on discovering these vast, untapped reservoirs of power. We all know this. I mean, this has happened.
One of the biggest issues at stake tomorrow is in Ohio, where voters go to the polls to decide on an amendment to the Ohio State Constitution that would effectively block any implementation of the president's health care overhaul.
Power has to counteract power. You can't expect the 10th Amendment to enforce itself. The states have to assert themselves. That's the idea behind state nullification.
Power has to counteract power. We've got that video on sale. We'd ask you to purchase a copy tonight. Please read it. You will feel empowered. My job here tonight is to empower you, is to make you feel like we can defy Washington, D.C., and we're not sinning against God doing it. In fact, a case could be made because we've not been good stewards of the liberty that he gave us. We're sinning there because there's blood on our hands, folks. We have to make good arguments about this. Here's what Samuel Adams said in August 1776 before the Philadelphia legislature to people who wouldn't stand back then. He said, if you love wealth better than liberty, the tranquility of servitude better than the animating contest of freedom, then go home from us in peace. We ask not your counsels, nor your arms. Crouch down and lick the hands which feed you. May your chains set lightly upon you, and may posterity forget that you were our countrymen. They had people back then that were weak in the knees. You can't be weak in the knees today. Paul talked about the German evangelical church. As they sat by while 6 million Jews were slaughtered. We aren't even able to say here in America today that we can't be the German evangelical church, because we are just like that. We don't just have 6 million dead Jews in our hands. We got 55 million dead babies. So to wrap it up, we're a representative republic. We hold all the power. We have 5 solutions we're offering you tonight. Think like a founder. You've got to begin to think like those guys back at the beginning of my presentation on that clip. You've got to have their courage. You've got to learn about nullification. You've got to play your part. You've got to connect with us. Give us your email address. We're going to be holding Liberty boot camps around the state where we spend a day walking you through the history from 1774 to 1925. We're going to show you where everything came off the tracks and how we fix it. So join the Liberty Network. We are looking to train 100 pastors and 500 citizen activists in this state. At the end of the day, folks, we've got to be courageous. We've got to think big. We've got to act big to decentralize power away from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much. Thank you.